The atmosphere within the Oval Office often carried the dense burden of historical significance. Yet, on this specific winter afternoon, the air seemed charged with a pressure that was far more urgent and menacing. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, walked into the chamber displaying the rehearsed assurance of a figure who was convinced he represented the destiny of the Democratic Party. He was clad in a Tom Ford suit priced higher than the monthly mortgage payments of most citizens, while his hair was smoothed back with a structural exactness that resisted nature, appearing exactly like the media favorite who had adorned the fronts of GQ and Rolling Stone. He had arrived in Washington anticipating a standard partisan conflict, a minor display of political theatrics, where he might establish himself as the brave leader of the resistance opposing the federal government. During his flight, he had practiced his introductory remarks, formulating sound bites tailored for the nightly broadcasts, prepared to school the president regarding California's financial power and its progressive qualifications. He felt entirely invulnerable, shielded by his state's colossal economy and his standing as the assumed leading contender for the 2028 nomination. Newsom hardly paused to approach the seating before the resolute desk before beginning his scripted statement, his voice emitting the polished and nearly patronizing timbre he saved for political adversaries he considered inferior. "Mr. President, I will be straightforward," Newsom started, motioning with an impeccably groomed hand. "I am not completely certain why I have been called here today, since California is prospering, despite your administration's persistent efforts at federal interference. Our economy ranks as the fifth largest globally, powering the national machine, and we are guiding the country in climate initiatives, diversity, and technological innovation. If this gathering is merely because you are jealous that we are winning without your assistance, or is an effort to show off for your supporters, I truly lack the time for trivial political maneuvers." He stopped, anticipating the predictable interruption, ready to counter with another rehearsed quip. "Sit down, Gavin." President Trump's voice sliced through the governor's speech like a diamond blade cutting through crystal. It was not yelled, nor was it furious, but rather the completely steady tone of a person who possessed immense authority in that precise instant and understood exactly how to wield it. The disruption halted Newsom in the middle of his motion, causing the governor to blink as his practiced smile wavered for a split second before he regained his composure. He scanned the office, finally absorbing the reality of the setting, and understood that this was not the routine political appointment he had expected. Trump was not surrounded by political consultants or communications aides, but instead, standing behind the resolute desk like mute guardians of federal might, were the designers of Newsom's downfall. To the right of Trump stood FBI Director Christopher Wray, his expression a veil of professional impartiality, with his hands placed upon 3 dense black binders labeled with classified markings. Beside him was Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, appearing less like a political nominee and more like a forensic auditor ready to analyze a failing asset, equipped with piles of financial review papers. Rounding out the severe trio was HUD Inspector General Ray Oliver Davis, a lifelong auditor whose whole career was founded on locating lost government funds, clutching pages of statistical data concerning California's homelessness expenditures. All 3 appeared serious, businesslike, and completely unconcerned with political argumentation. The mood within the Oval Office was not one conducive to bargaining, but rather the chilly, antiseptic vibe of a prosecution desk right before opening statements commence. Newsom, still striving to keep the advantage, released a rehearsed and scornful laugh while remaining on his feet to broadcast a dominance he no longer experienced. "Oh, honestly," he remarked, glancing from Ray to Trump, asking if this was some type of performance piece or trivial vengeance for the 2002 election cycle, insisting he was not scared by props, and noting that while he was present for serious policy talk, he had a state to govern if this was merely theater. Trump did not take the bait, nor did he elevate his volume, but simply leaned ahead slightly, placing his elbows on the desk, and stated $68 billion, a figure that dropped into the silent room like a heavy physical load. "I beg your pardon," Newsom uttered, briefly knocked off his script. Trump said the number again with slow clarity, emphasizing that $68 billion is the precise sum of taxpayer currency the state of California has utilized for homelessness initiatives since his inauguration in 2019, comprising federal, state, and local resources flowing through his administration's financial oversight. Trump hesitated, allowing the immense size of that statistic to resonate, noting that it is an astounding quantity of cash which could reconstruct whole cities, yet asking if Gavin wanted to know what occurred to the homeless demographic during that identical time frame while he was expending all those funds. Trump did not pause for a response, revealing it rose by 46%, meaning nearly half again as many individuals are dwelling in tents on pavements and beneath bridges, despite $68 billion being pumped into the framework to halt it. Using just one finger, Trump slid one of the dense files across the gleaming top of the resolute desk until it stopped merely inches from where Newsom stood. The exterior of the binder was unadorned, yet what lay inside was catastrophic. "Therefore, I am going to pose a very basic inquiry to you, Gavin, and I recommend you deliberate very cautiously on your reply," Trump stated, his gaze fixing upon the governor, asking where $68 billion went, since it surely did not reach the people on the streets. Newsom's assured grin finally formed a legitimate crack, a tiny fissure in the costly veneer of his public image. For the initial time since stepping onto the White House property, Gavin Newsom comprehended that he had absolutely no concept of what he had stumbled into. Trump did not wait for Newsom to recover his balance, leaning back into his tall leather seat with a look of clinical scrutiny instead of rage. "I will inform you precisely where it ended up," Trump went on, his tone stable and unyielding, explaining that it did not vanish into the void but rather went to his primary political backers, to nonprofits managed by his campaign financiers, and to advisory groups that channeled a share of that cash directly back into his political machine. "You have been methodically robbing the California taxpayer while citizens are actually perishing on the pavements of San Francisco and Los Angeles, and while the middle class is escaping your state in historic waves because they cannot pay the rent. You were utilizing the homelessness emergency as a private cash machine for your 2028 aspirations. And the finest detail, Gavin, is that I can substantiate every single word of this claim." FBI Director Christopher Wray moved ahead, his motion exact and intentional, opening the initial thick binder to display a sequence of records on the resolute desk, with the practiced competence of an experienced attorney. "Oh, Governor Newsom," Wray started, his pitch lacking any political hostility which rendered it even more frightening, stating that for the last 8 months, under the President's order, the FBI has been performing a thorough multi-agency forensic review of every significant homelessness agreement California has granted since his swearing in. This was not a brief look at the ledgers, for we have examined every budget item, every electronic transfer, and every shell corporation implicated in the operation. We have pinpointed $23 billion in expenditures that we can now classify as demonstrably fraudulent. Newsom's stance finally started to reveal his distress, as he did not merely sit but collapsed into the seat, with his expensive suit suddenly appearing like a burden he was too weak to bear. The favored son of the West Coast was gazing at banking logs, contract grants, and business filings that he had presumed were concealed beneath tiers of state red tape. Wray indicated a particular sheet describing no-bid agreements, noting they possessed the paper trail of state deals given to firms possessed by his leading political contributors, companies lacking previous background in housing or social work. "We hold proof of hugely exaggerated invoices for services that were never performed, and strategic advisory charges that were merely laundered bribes streaming straight into political action committees he manages. This is not conjecture, Governor, but a blueprint of a criminal syndicate. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent followed, his voice sharp and businesslike as he presented a fresh collection of files, noting that while the homelessness scam is the biggest segment of the riddle, they also investigated his private financial concerns. He spoke while retrieving the files on Newsom's personal business endeavors, stating that his family's wine enterprises, the Plumpjack Group, Odette Estate, and Cade Winery, have obtained $47 million in state agreements, tax relief, and farm subsidies since he became governor. This is a classic example of self-dealing, as you have utilized your executive power to immediately profit your private assets, frequently via agencies whose leaders you appointed personally. Under California statutes, that constitutes a breach of the government code, while under federal law it is blatant fraud. And HUD Inspector General Ray Oliver Davis struck the final devastating hit by adding that, beyond the self-dealing, they tracked $340 million in transfers from state contractors straight into a sequence of shell LLCs. Davis remarked, her finger outlining a diagram of cash flow that concluded with Newsom's political machine, that these are not campaign donations abiding by FEC regulations, but are illicit transfers of public funds masked as operational costs. That constitutes money laundering, Gavin, and since this behavioral pattern implicates numerous individuals, various agencies, and has happened steadily over many years, it warrants a federal RICO prosecution. The term RICO, standing for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, appeared to siphon the lingering vitality from Newsom's visage, for it was the statute utilized to destroy the mafia and the supreme tool of the federal government against organized syndicates. Trump allowed the quiet to extend for a lengthy beat, observing as Newsom's eyes flickered among the three detectives, while the governor's hands were now clutching the chair arms so intensely that the leather creaked. He resembled a man who had just been informed that his whole universe was constructed on a base of sand and the ocean tide was finally rising. "So here is how this will proceed, Gavin," Trump said, his voice lowering to a softer and more intimate volume. "You are going to reach a verdict right now that decides if you pass a few years in a cozy state institution or the remainder of your natural existence in a federal prison. You stand at an intersection, and I am only offering you two choices, with no third path, no spinning this to your allies at the New York Times, and no resistance oration that rescues you from a RICO charge." Trump raised a single digit, stating option 1 is that he resigns as governor of California today, effective at once, returns to Sacramento, cites personal or medical grounds, or whatever falsehood helps him rest, and confronts the state-level corruption accusations. You accept a plea bargain with the California Attorney General, serving perhaps 6 years, and you are released before turning 60, meaning your political vocation is deceased, but you are a liberated man in a few years. He then lifted a second finger, outlining option 2, where he exits this room believing he can battle him, thinking his media pals can shield him, and tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Trump stands in the Rose Garden and publishes every single sheet of this audit to the populace. Every wire transaction, every deceitful contract, and every email will be released. Then the DOJ files RICO charges, leaving you facing 25 years to life, meaning you will be 70 years old before smelling fresh air again. And Gavin, federal RICO defendants do not go to minimum security camps. They go to actual prisons with actual felons. Newsom attempted to talk, but his voice was a frail and slender rasp, saying, "You cannot possibly prove," as his effort at rebellion perished in his throat when Trump shoved another pile of papers toward him. "We possess the bank statements," Trump stated evenly, adding that they have the emails, the text messages, and most significantly, they have the people, for they offered immunity to several of his contractors, and they are confessing everything. They have provided the dates, the sums, and the identities of the individuals in his office who managed the bribes, meaning this is not a bluff, Gavin, but a burial for his aspirations. So what will it be? Do you wish to quit silently, or do you wish to be annihilated on national television? The quiet in the Oval Office was total. A dense and smothering heaviness that appeared to squeeze the very breath out of Gavin Newsom. For a man who had constructed his whole career on a base of charm, refined speech, and the skill to twist any emergency into a political win, the truth of the papers sitting on the resolute desk was a conclusion he was not ready for. His intellect, typically a rapid processor of strategic tactics, was presently frozen, stuck in a repetition of the word RICO as he viewed the binders, 3 giant tomes of proof, and understood that the golden youth of California was no longer the predator but the quarry, and the snare had been locked tight. "You must comprehend the magnitude of what we are facing," FBI Director Wray said, fracturing the quiet with a tone as frigid as a winter dawn in the Sierras, explaining that to grasp how we reached this instant, one must review the past 8 months. While you were posing for photos at the French Laundry, or delivering addresses regarding the California Way, my operatives were deep within the infrastructure of your state's fiscal networks. We did not merely examine the top-tier budget figures, but we followed the transit of pennies and charted the links between his campaign's biggest donors and the abrupt emergence of multi-million-dollar no-bid agreements. Trump monitored Newsom intently, his gaze acute and evaluating, not gloating but watching the disintegration of a competitor with the removed curiosity of a construction inspector seeing a defective edifice finally buckle. "You believed you were more intelligent than everyone else, Gavin," Trump remarked, his voice lowering to a deep, gravelly pitch, "thinking that because you controlled the media and held a supermajority in Sacramento, you could handle the state's vault like your private trust fund. Yet $68 billion is a vast sum to misplace. Citizens observe when you expend that sort of money, and the sole thing that expands is the dimension of the encampments on the 101. So I became personally fixated on it as an entrepreneur because the arithmetic did not add up, making it impossible for it to be anything except a colossal organized robbery." Wray turned to a portion of the folder labeled with a vivid red tab for Phase 1, proposing they discuss the 12 hours before he entered this chamber, noting that 12 hours prior he awoke in the governor's residence in Sacramento, drinking costly espresso, while viewing survey data indicating a 73% approval score among California Democrats. You were perusing articles about yourself in shiny periodicals being celebrated as the destiny of the opposition. You obtained the order for this gathering and rejected it as administrative static. And while your chief of staff, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, voiced warning, you dismissed her. You essentially told her that Trump is floundering, and this is merely him attempting to bully the leader for 2028. Being so dazzled by your own image that you failed to spot the federal detective standing directly outside your gate. Wray proceeded, his finger thrusting at a diagram resembling a web of corruption, stating that while he was having his hair styled for this appointment, the Treasury and the FBI were completing the detailed map of his homelessness expenditures. We discovered $23 billion, billion with a B, that flowed to agreements with obvious fraud signs. Speaking of no-bid grants to businesses with zero staff and advisory groups that were nothing but a postal box in a shopping plaza. One particular instance involves California Housing Solutions, a nonprofit that obtained $340 million to construct 400 housing units, which is $850,000 per unit for a simple studio in a renovated motel, an impossible calculation even in your state. We tracked $280 million of those funds, finding it did not go to timber or workforce, but to companies possessed by his past campaign directors and significant contributors, as Treasury Secretary Besant contributed her own level to the accusation. It was not merely the massive political robbery, she said with a sharp and expert tone, but the personal avarice, since his wine companies, Plumpjack, Odette, and Cade, took in $47 million in state deals and grants. You assumed the blind trust would shield you, yet we located the emails and the text correspondence between your bureau and the agency chiefs you nominated, instructing them to prefer your wineries for government events. You were billing the public double the market price for your own wine and utilizing farming aids intended for suffering growers to fit opulent water systems at your estate vineyards, which is the type of obvious self-enrichment that would have a CEO terminated and imprisoned instantly. Newsom's hands were trembling now, a subtle shake he could not conceal even by clutching the chair arms, as the walls of the Oval Office, which had once appeared as the unavoidable goal of his career, now felt like they were collapsing inward. He stared at the HUD Inspector General, who was displaying data on homeless fatalities, showing mortality rates had risen 48% under his supervision, as the truth was being denuded of its political sheen, revealing he was not being blamed for a policy error, but for a death toll. The funds that ought to have rescued Jennifer Martinez, the insolvent educator, or Marcus Johnson, the veteran with PTSD, had instead been utilized to finance his 2028 survey research and the way of life of his inner circle. Trump leaned closer, his silhouette casting over the papers on the desk, stating the proposal is available, giving Gavin one opportunity to resign tonight. Go home. Tell whatever narrative he desires to the California populace. Confront the state attorney general, serve his 6 years, and escape with his life. Alternatively, you depart from here and tomorrow the FBI submits the RICO accusation, meaning you will pass the subsequent 30 years in a cage observing your offspring mature through a glass divider, while the globe recalls you as the male who pilfered from the most destitute. You possess 60 seconds to determine. 60 seconds before the federal administration terminates the Newsom heritage permanently, and the quiet in the chamber was ear-splitting as the 1-minute timer started, making Gavin Newsom, once the composed and refined visage of the California dream, appear like a man who had abruptly aged 2 decades. The artificial lighting of the Oval Office mirrored off his smoothed hair, but the assured spark in his eyes had been substituted by an empty and tormented gaze as he glanced down at his hands, which were now shivering uncontrollably on his thighs. He pondered his wife Jennifer and their kids. He remembered the shiny magazine fronts and the cheering of the mobs in Sacramento, all of which was vanishing in the sterile, frigid atmosphere of the chamber, superseded by the bleak truth of a jail cell. 10 seconds, Gavin, Trump uttered, his tone as consistent as a pulse, not checking his timepiece because he did not need to, knowing precisely how much strain he was exerting. Newsom raised his eyes, his complexion pale, and his mouth parting and shutting, as he fought to locate the terms that would formally conclude his existence as he understood it, while the $1,500 suit abruptly felt like a restraint, and the burden of $23 billion in recorded deceit seemed to crush his chest. He glanced at FBI Director Wray and then at Secretary Besant, hunting for even a trace of compassion or a fissure in their professional determination, yet he discovered zero, for they were the designers of a sealed enclosure, and he was finally within it. "I will resign," Newsom murmured, the vocables tasting like dust in his mouth, as he bent forward with his elbows on his knees and his head in his palms, signifying the golden youth had finally shattered. Trump did not triumph, nor did he present a festive grin, but merely gestured to the White House attorney, who advanced with a lone page of paper, a pre-written resignation note with an empty line for the governor's autograph. "Wise choice, Gavin," Trump remarked, his inflection shifting to one of swift corporate conclusiveness, noting it is the sole option that does not finish with him perishing in a federal prison, and instructing him to sign it now so it can be issued to the media at 11 o'clock tonight. Newsom accepted the silver writing instrument presented to him, his digits struggling with its heft, And, as he pushed the tip to the document, he understood he was not merely signing a note, but authorizing the execution order of his presidential dreams, his fame, and his liberty. He scrawled his name, the identical graceful handwriting that had approved billions in deceitful agreements, and observed as the fluid dried, feeling the chamber become slightly less heavy as the instant menace of a RICO charge withdrew, just enough to let him respire. Although the shade of the state-level corruption accusations still towered, he was no longer the commander of the opposition, but a shamed bureaucrat taking an exit toward irrelevance. Here is what occurs subsequently, Trump stated, drawing the autographed letter back over the desk, instructing him to return to his hotel, not to phone the press or his backers, but to call his kin, and at 11 at night, the news emerges that he is quitting for personal and medical causes. Tomorrow morning, the California Attorney General will obtain the recommendation from our detectives. You will bargain your plea agreement for 10 years, serve your 6, and vanish. But if you attempt to alter the story, play the martyr on cable television, or even murmur the term persecution, the accord is void, and we file the RICO accusations the following hour. Do you comprehend? Newsom nodded quietly, incapable of meeting the president's gaze, and rose on trembling limbs, the grace that had characterized his profession totally gone, making him appear diminished, frightened, and ensnared. As he pivoted to depart the Oval Office, the Secret Service team that had accompanied him inside shifted into place to guide him out. Not as a visiting VIP, but as a male under the vigilant observation of the statutes. He strolled through the West Wing by the paintings of former rulers, recognizing that his own image would eternally be linked to the $68 billion that disappeared while his state incinerated. And the California way had guided him straight into a snare of his own creation, where the outlet was a lengthy, obscure passage toward a jail entrance. The report of the abdication emerged at precisely 11 post-meridian Eastern Time, a moment meticulously selected to capture the late-night broadcast loops on the East Coast and the prime-time viewers in California. The White House Media Bureau issued a brief 3-paragraph declaration that propelled the worldwide press into a condition of immediate chaotic action. The announcement asserted that Governor Gavin Newsom had submitted his departure to the California Secretary of State, effective at once, referencing unexpected personal and health-linked difficulties that demand his total and separated focus. It was a triumph of political ambiguity intended to supply a momentary veil of validity while the federal government's detectives remained in the background, their folders of proof stowed away for the moment. Within moments, the spirited and dynamic realm of California politics was immersed in a state of total, perplexed disorder, and, in Sacramento, the state capital, the mood was one of deep and pure astonishment. Employees in the governor's suite, many having utilized the day readying for standard legislative meetings or future galas, were observed gazing at video screens in incredulity, some still clutching semi-consumed mugs of Java. The golden child of the West Coast, the figure who had outlasted a recall effort and was broadly seen as the unavoidable heir to the Democratic seat, had merely disappeared from the political platform in one night. The legislative corridors, typically humming with the commerce of the nation's most inhabited state, turned into phantom villages as hearsay started to rotate like a blaze in the arid slopes. Reporters from the Los Angeles Times and the San Francisco Chronicle rushed to their offices, desperately phoning every connection they possessed in the governor's private group, only to discover a barrier of quiet. The personal health story was being doubted nearly as quickly as it was spoken, with political experts noting that Newsom had seemed in prime physical shape just hours prior during his broadcast entrance at the White House. Throughout the nation, the political tremors were equally severe in Washington, D.C., yet party command was trapped in a crossfire of alarm and disarray. Numerous top party executives had linked their own political destinies to the Newsom heritage, seeing him as the rampart against the Trump administration's plan, so witnessing him quit so suddenly and following a private gathering in the Oval Office implied a breakdown of a far more structural and disastrous kind. Republican legislators, meanwhile, were wary, many feeling that the medical grounds were simply a strategic withdrawal prior to a bigger judicial tempest. The all-day news channels shifted their whole reporting to the Newsom departure, inviting medical specialists to theorize on unseen sicknesses and political confidants to estimate concealed controversies. Yet the true narrative stayed secured behind the gates of the West Wing, where the electronic autographs and money transfer logs were being readied for their ultimate trip to the California Attorney General. As the midnight time elapsed in California, the tangible truth of the changeover started to occur, as Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis was called to an urgent meeting to be informed on her instant oath-taking. The procedure was grave and rushed, a sharp difference from the festive inductions of history, and Kounalakis, a durable partner of Newsom, stood before a tiny group of lenses appearing as shocked as the populace she was now assigned to guide. Her short comments centered on persistence and steadiness, but her gaze revealed the anxiety of a chief receiving a state whose base was being silently taken apart by federal detectives. In the avenues of San Francisco and Los Angeles, the report was received with a blend of bewilderment and a peculiar brewing optimism among those who had become disenchanted with the $68 billion flop to manage the homelessness emergency. They were unaware of the RICO menace or the plumpjack agreements yet, but they realized that the existing state of affairs had been smashed. The most revealing moments, however, happened far from the public view at his inn in Washington, where Gavin Newsom sat in a dim suite with the illuminations of the metropolis glimmering beneath him. He was no longer the assured diplomat, but a man abiding for the sun to ascend on an existence he no longer identified. Having placed the calls he needed to make to his spouse, his nearest kin, and his law squad, and every chat had been a version of the identical sad epiphany. The $1,500 outfit was hung over a seat, a thrown-away artifact of a character that had been revealed as an empty casing, and he viewed the cable news reporting of his own sickness, hearing the experts laud his brave choice to place family initially, and for a second he might have trusted he had an opportunity to flee. But then he stared at the disposable telephone on the desk, the straight connection to the White House counsel, and recalled the 60-second timer, knowing the pact was inked, the snare was laid, and the California way was about to encounter the American judicial framework. By the early dawn of the ensuing day, the story started to move from if Newsom would quit to why he had done so with such frightening velocity. Probing journalists, already leery of the schedule, started excavating into the flight logs of the FBI and Treasury officers who had been seen in D.C. that afternoon. They started to observe the weird concurrences, the abrupt silence of major California builders, the locking of specific overseas funds, and the odd busyness at the state's homelessness committee. The private health falsehood was a barrier that was commencing to fracture under the strain of 1,000 inquiries, meaning that Gavin Newsom's departure was not the conclusion of the tale, but merely the starting scene of a multi-billion-dollar criminal judgment that was about to alter the visage of California politics eternally. The Golden Youth had walked off the platform, but the illuminations were only becoming more intense, and they were aimed straight at the $68 billion void he had abandoned. The proclamation of felony accusations against Gavin Newsom did not originate from a federal structure in Washington, but from a packed media hall in Sacramento, presented by California Attorney General Rob Bonta. The paradox was dense enough to strangle the chamber, as Bonta, a durable friend and nominee of the ex-governor, stood behind a lectern decorated with the state crest, his countenance a guise of grave occupational obligation. He started by admitting the unexampled and hurtful character of the incident, but declared that the proof revealed by a combined federal-state squad left the Department of Justice with no alternative route. The accusation was a gigantic file numbering over 80 charges of deceit, theft, and civic decay. Yet the story it wove was astonishingly plain. The $68 billion intended for California's most defenseless had instead been utilized to construct a multi-tiered political and private kingdom. The heart of the bribery plot, as Bonta elaborated, focused on the tactical granting of homelessness deals to a chosen ring of Newsom's most productive contributors. The Attorney General displayed a roster of the state's leading 50 political givers between 2019 and 2024, a register of California's technology aristocracy, property tycoons, and potent influencers. He then superimposed that list with a repository of state agreement grants, and the link was a numerical horror for the defense, as those 50 backers had obtained nearly $5 billion in state deals, a yield on investment of over $56 for every single buck they had given to Newsom's drives and related PACs. Bonta characterized this as a methodical commercial venture in the governor's bureau, where public monies were handled as a good to be swapped for political fidelity and election currency. As the specifics started to drip through the afternoon, the precise workings of the bribe cycle were uncovered, showing it was not as raw as currency in packets, but was a refined washing process that utilized tactical advisory groups as the main sieve. A nonprofit would accept a huge no-bid state agreement to erect helpful lodging at a hugely puffed-up price, frequently exceeding $800,000 per apartment. That nonprofit would subsequently employ advisory businesses possessed by Newsom's past employees or campaign partners, paying them millions in supervision charges for labor that, per FBI interrogations, never actually happened. Those companies would then pivot and generate immense autonomous outlays to back Newsom's political plan, meaning the cash was a shut loop journeying from the state vault to a donor-led nonprofit through a politically linked advisor and back into the governor's renewal engine. The private gain facet of the charge was possibly the most harmful to Newsom's public stature, peeling away the minister-leader disguise to expose a design of obvious avarice. Secretary Besant's forensic review of the Plumpjack Group and the related vineyards became a central theme of the disclosure, as the files demonstrated that while Newsom had put the trades in a blind trust, he had personally named the chiefs of the bureaus that went on to award those very trades $47 million in illicit grants, tax pauses, and sole wine-serving deals for state occasions. The blind trust, it seemed, had been fully gaping, with emails displaying Newsom's top crew ordering agency bosses to guarantee the governor's wineries were looked after during fiscal talks. The picture of the French Laundry governor was supplanted by the Plumpjack tycoon, a male who employed his position to make sure his clan's riches expanded while his state's median class was scooped out. By late day, the human toll of the swindle was being transmitted across every news grid as the FBI started issuing video questionings with homeless persons who had been let down by the structure. These were not political commentators, but folks like Jennifer Martinez, a past educator who had slumbered on a Los Angeles pavement for 3 years, while a nonprofit just miles distant sat on $340 million of idle state cash. The death data were the concluding spooky measure of the suit, as homeless expirations in California had risen nearly 50% during Newsom's term, a number that federal detectives linked directly to the larceny of the monies that ought to have supplied health aid and urgent refuge. This is not merely regarding office offenses, one detective remarked to the media, but about a death tally financed by public bucks. The debris within the Democratic Party was immediate and savage, as in a synchronized attempt to separate themselves from the toxic ruin of the Newsom heritage. National party chiefs started refunding gifts and erasing the ex-governor's picture from their formal internet sites. The Golden Child had turned into a warning fable, a political outcast whose contact was now viewed as a doom decree for any 2028 aspiration. Even as Newsom sat in his lodging chamber in D.C., feeling the judicial and political partitions shut in, The comprehension was finally settling that the $1,500 outfit and the flawlessly groomed locks could not shield him from the heft of $68 billion in absent currency. The California way had reached a termination in a Sacramento media hall, and the tribunal of the era was only just commencing. The barriers of Gavin Newsom's Washington hotel suite felt as if they were contracting, with the luxury of the space now a taunting difference to the medical gray of the destiny waiting for him. For 48 hours, the private health story had acted as a brittle dike restraining a flood of federal proof that was already dripping through the fissures of the all-day news loop. He had passed the evening in a frantic circle of telephone chats with his prime legal squad, men who billed $1,000 an hour to inform him precisely what he did not wish to audit, that the federal state was not feigning. The wire moves were recorded, the safety pacts with his past builders were inked, and the blind trust was being handled as a clear falsehood by forensic bookkeepers. The 60-second timer Trump had initiated in the Oval Office was still beating in Newsom's skull, a steady memory that every hour he wasted holding to a policy plea carried him nearer to a life term in a federal lockup. The ultimate understanding arrived when his chief attorney, a past top-tier DOJ officer, presented the bleak arithmetic of a RICO suit. Gavin, if we step into a federal tribunal, we are not just battling about wine grants, the advocate had spoken, his tone level. We are combating a racketeering matter implicating $23 billion in swindle and a methodical criminal syndicate. The guilty verdict frequency for federal RICO suits is above 90%, and if you fail, and with the observers they possess you will fail, you are going to expire in a coop, being 75 years old, before you are even qualified for a review. The Golden Youth finally viewed the option for what it was, an exit toward a 10-year span of disgrace, or a rapid crash with the total mass of the United States administration. He lacked the gut for a 30-year conflict, so he lifted the safe line to the White House counsel and indicated his capitulation. The plea talks that ensued were managed with the chilly effectiveness of a business dissolution, as Trump's regime possessed all the advantage, and they utilized it to guarantee that the Newsom heritage was not merely beaten, but taken apart. The bargain was savage in its plainness, as Newsom would forego his privilege to a hearing and admit guilt to 5 main charges of state-level deceit, theft, and civic decay in return for the federal state discarding the RICO accusations and the life-term menace. Newsom would supply complete and truthful aid concerning the web of builders and advisors who had eased the bribe plots, essentially being requested to surrender the codes to the whole political engine that had constructed him, a concluding deed of treachery that would make certain no one in his private ring could ever ascend to authority again. As the conditions were completed, the fiscal ruin of the governor's existence became obvious, since the pact demanded an instant surrender of $28 million in payback. Cash the state claimed was straightly linked to the illicit gains his wine trades had accepted. His private riches, once gauged at over $20 million, were effectively erased by the mix of penalties, repayment, and the colossal law charges he had accrued attempting to battle the unavoidable. He was not merely forfeiting his liberty, but was being methodically deprived of the assets that had permitted him to navigate the globe with such noble comfort. The $1,500 suits would be substituted by state-provided denim, and the Napa Valley vistas would be exchanged for the barren ground of a medium-security complex. The most painful portion of the procedure for Newsom was the open confession of fault, for he had devoted 20 years to honing the craft of the non-apology apology, the rehearsed diversion that converted every error into a study chance or a partisan assault. Yet the plea concord compelled him to rise in a hall of justice and concede on the log that he had deliberately steered monies intended for the homeless to profit his backers and himself. There would be no twist, no background, and no health-linked alibis, as he would have to view the proof of the $850,000 studio flats and grant they were a mask for a criminal plot. The male who desired to be president was being coerced to confess he was a robber, and by the close of the week, the platform was arranged for the concluding scene. Newsom's squad had obtained a settlement with the California Attorney General's Bureau, overseen by the federal watchers, meaning the judgment was fixed at 10 years in a state institution with a probable discharge after 6 years for proper conduct. It was the finest result he could anticipate. A frightening notion for a human who just days prior trusted he was invincible as he got ready to soar back to California for the final occasion as a liberated male. Newsom sat in the rear of a dimmed SUV observing the D.C. memorials glide by the pane, realizing he had come to this metropolis to seize a crown, but was departing it to fulfill a penalty. The Golden State's preferred offspring was heading home to confront the consequences, and the initial chords were already starting to sound. The judgment session in Sacramento seemed less like a judicial process and more like a concluding public banishment of a political age. The tribunal was filled to its total limit with reporters, past aides, and, most importantly, delegates from the neighborhoods Newsom had most profoundly deceived. Gavin Newsom sat at the defense desk, his once flawless look now visibly worn, as the costly outfit draped slackly on a body that had blatantly shed pounds, and the renowned structural hair was finally starting to display lines of untended silver. He rested with his head lowered, the stance of a person who had finally depleted his escapes, while behind him the audience was an ocean of lenses and chilly critical gazes, all waiting to observe the official tumble of the golden child. Judge Michael Fitzgerald, a figure recognized for his unwavering loyalty to the statute and a fame for a blade-sharp dialect, directed the meeting. He passed over 60 minutes examining the closing victim effect declarations, phrases from folks who had dwelled in the shade of the $68 billion chasm. When it ultimately arrived at the moment for the judgment, the chamber went so quiet you could detect the drone of the tribunal's electronic taping gear. Fitzgerald did not instantly recite the penalty, but instead stared straight at Newsom, his eyes firm and brimming with a hushed cerebral rage as he spoke to the ex-governor not as a VIP, but as a regular burglar who had used a tall post to victimize the very folks he had vowed to defend. "Mr. Newsom, you possessed everything," Judge Fitzgerald commenced, his vocalization resonating through the hall. "You held riches, you held sway, and you held a degree of civic faith that most statesmen spend a lifespan fantasizing about. You could have genuinely aided the citizens of this province, having the means to alter thousands of existences, yet instead you elected to handle the state vault like a private savings jar for your pals and your individual way of life. You paused on platforms and talked about ethical mandates, while you were approving $850,000 studio flats that were nothing more than a cover for your contributors' cash stashes. You chatted about compassion while you utilized public funds to support your own vineyards and finance a life of splendor that 99% of your voters will never experience." The magistrate leaned closer, his digit striking the dense pile of the concluding review, noting that the real disaster of his deeds is not just the currency, but the mortality toll. While you were tallying your gifts and rejoicing at the French Laundry, the humans you pledged to rescue were perishing on the walkways of our towns, meaning homeless expirations rose by nearly 50% on your guard, because the cash that ought to have purchased drugs and cover was instead procuring political spots and advisory charges for your private ring. You cheated the civic confidence in the most shocking and planned manner I have witnessed in my decades on the seat, and I only desire the statute permitted me to doom you to more than the 10 years settled in this plea pact, because 10 years in a cage does not commence to address the harm you have inflicted on the spirit of this territory. The verdict was then voiced: 10 years in a California state complex with a compulsory repayment of $28 million and a lasting prohibition from ever keeping public rank or practicing law in the region again. Newsom was commanded to be taken into detention instantly, and the tribunal burst in a storm of lens clicks and murmured breaths as the guards neared the defense station. The male who had once been the most potent Democrat in the West was told to rise and put his hands behind his spine, and the noise of the manacles locking shut over his wrists was aired live to millions of folks, a keen metallic period mark at the closure of a 20-year vocation. As Newsom was guided out via the flank exit, he did not glance back at the lenses or the audience, keeping his eyes glued on the deck with his shoulders drooped, the heaviness of the 10-year doom finally resting into his skeleton. The $1,500 outfit was an antique now, a disguise for an existence that no longer survived, for he was no longer a ruler, a film icon statesman, or a presidential dreamer, but prisoner number S-73,849, a found guilty criminal bound toward a cage in Solano. The California way had formally struck a blind alley, and as the hall vacated, the quiet that stayed was the sole thing remaining of the heritage Gavin Newsom had passed a lifetime constructing. Gavin Newsom's advent at California State Prison, Solano, was a bizarre crash of two spheres that were never intended to join, as stripped of his bespoke suits and his honor, the man who had once been the most mighty figure in the West was handled like any other convict, fingerprinted, snapped in a rough denim kit, and allotted a slender pad in a medium-security room. The shift from the governor's estate to prisoner S-73,849 was a savage mental jolt. As the noted Newsom profile, once bordered by the banners of the United States and California, was now outlined against chilly concrete brick barriers and a metal-edged bed. The quiet of his cubicle was maybe the most torturous portion for a male whose days had been a steady storm of clapping, updates, and broadcast talks, so the abrupt lack of a crowd felt like a corporeal mass pushing down on his bust. The initial year of his confinement witnessed the complete and methodical failure of his private existence, a retarded decay that was followed with grim charm by the national media. Merely 6 months after he entered the portals of Solano, his spouse, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, lodged for separation, and, while the legal papers quoted unresolvable conflicts, the underlying meaning was plain to anyone tracking the reports, that the Newsom label was toxic, and she was acting to save what persisted of her own destiny and that of their offspring. She retained the bulk of their lingering wealth, reinstated her birth name, and relocated her existence far from the shade of the male who had turned into the visage of California's biggest rot affair. His kids, once the regular icons of his social streams, were now guarded by a barrier of seclusion, their surnames altered to separate them from the $68 billion pit their dad had abandoned. Within the jail barriers, Newsom found himself in a strange sort of solitude, for while he was defended from the common inhabitants owing to his famous rank, he was not excused from the truths of penal existence. He was appointed to labor in the jail book depository, a desired post for peaceful convicts, where he passed his hours listing beat-up novels and helping other prisoners with judicial study. The ex-governor, who once commanded the strategy of the globe's fifth biggest economy, was now charged with making sure that an assortment of tired suspense stories and obsolete school books stayed in lettered sequence. He was often spotted resting at a tiny marred timber table, the noted golden child appearance waning under the cruel blinking neon lamps of the archive, as the silver in his locks, once a strategic hint of adulthood, had now conquered totally, and his mug had become thin and haggard from the severe jail food. The exterior globe kept proceeding without him, frequently with a savagery that only statecraft can generate, as the Democratic Party, which had once acclaimed him as its redeemer, had totally rejected him. His title was erased from formal group chronicles, and his past partners wasted their broadcast chats clarifying how they had always held worries about his regime's shortage of supervision. Every flopped homelessness task or decaying framework span was now tagged a Newsom heritage spot, a lasting memory of the billions that had disappeared into a net of bribes and self-profit. He was no longer a human, but a warning story, a verbal arm utilized by both wings of the hall to plead for openness, and the perils of unbridled administrative might. As the month shifted into a year, the mental cost of his drop became increasingly plain, and on the scarce times he was permitted callers, Newsom seemed unresponsive, his once lively chat talents substituted by lengthy, empty pauses. He passed hours gazing at the box in the shared hall, viewing the report loop he used to command now circle around his substitute Eleni Kounalakis and the changes she was applying to tidy up his clutter. He observed the Newsom regulation being enacted in Sacramento, a statute specifically crafted to hinder future rulers from using nonprofits for political cash washing, realizing he was a breathing phantom, a male who could view the sphere he once governed but could no longer handle, a person who had swapped his heritage for a stack of gold he could no longer disburse. By the conclusion of his initial year, Gavin Newsom had turned into a pupil of his own ruin, passing his evenings in the stacks perusing the review files the FBI had amassed against him, tracking the cable moves and the emails with a medical removed wonder. He ultimately comprehended the calculation that Trump had shown in the Oval Office, seeing the visages of the folks who had perished on the avenues while he was supping at the French Laundry. And, for the primary time, the strategy flop became a private load. The golden child of California was vanished, superseded by a graying male in a jean tunic, who realized that his soul-staying gift to history was to act as a signal of how simply a chief can misplace their path when they commence trusting their own news snippets. The last barrier of Solano State Prison squeaked ajar on a sharp, unconcerned dawn 6 years after Gavin Newsom had first penetrated its sides, and he walked out into the globe not as the victorious comeback of a political titan, but as a spook reverting to a realm that had long since unlearned the tone of his speech. At 63, the man once outlined by his Hollywood-grade beauty and limitless vigor was undistinguishable, as the gray hair was now a mass of snow. His dermis had been worn by years of facility illumination and strain, and the keen hunting aim of his stare had been displaced by a hush-muted self-analysis. He toted his few possessions in a tiny paper carton, a humble closing count for a male who had once supervised the funds of the world's fifth biggest economy, finding there were no lenses biding for him, no applauding backers, and no convoy. The Democratic Party had executed a complete and clinical cutting of his heritage, stripping his label from every formal edifice and sending back every gift linked to his term, while even his own offspring had proceeded under their mom's birth title, living existences that were cautiously fenced off from the debris of his standing. He was a man sans a nation and sans a faction, so heeding the counsel of his staying legal aid, he did not revert to the Bay Area or the grape region that had once been his domain, but instead embarked on a hushed public plane to Montana, relocating to a tiny, secluded plot he had managed to keep via a chain of intricate trusts. In the immense mute spread of the Bitterroot Valley, the past governor led an existence of intentional, nearly hermit-like dimness, passing his days tending the land and his nights perusing by a timber-firing heater. He was recognized to the scarce natives merely as Gavin, a hushed male who stayed to himself and utilized a great amount of time fly angling in the icy Peak Brooks, and it was in this quietude that the mass of the 68 billion finally appeared to rest into a lasting viewpoint. He was no longer the human who trusted he was fated for the Oval Office, but a man who grasped that he had bartered his spirit for a mound of bullion that he could no longer employ, and a fame that had soured into a toxin. He had desired to be a portion of the time, and he had triumphed, yet only as a warning section on the eating quality of unrestrained drive. And his concluding thought on the character of his tumble arrived during a scarce instant of honesty with a local bookkeeper, a man who had no clue of Gavin's history. They had been debating the idea of heritage, and Newsom, gazing out at the ragged tops of the hills, talked with a lucidness he never owned behind a lectern in Sacramento, remarking softly that the peril of being a golden child is that you commence to trust the radiance is emanating from you instead of bouncing off you. You imagine you are invincible because you are informed. You are every single day. You cease viewing the folks you are obliged to help and commence viewing them as stats to back your own tail. And by the moment I recognized I was a robber, the robbery was so huge that I could not spot the egress anymore. Back in California, the province maintained its tardy, hurting recuperation from the epoch of methodical rot, as the Newsom statute had winningly shielded the state vault from like ravenous plots, and the homelessness crunch, while still a scary test, was finally being tackled with a grade of clarity that had been missing for tens of years. The $23 billion in regained monies had been channeled into real physical sites and thorough mental sanity plans, so the folks Newsom had let down, the tutors, the old soldiers, and the kin on the edge, were finally witnessing the aid that had been vowed to them years earlier. The California Way was no longer a motto for a private label, but had turned into a plan for reconstructing the public faith via responsibility, and Gavin Newsom passed quietly in the frost of 2038, 10 years following his discharge. His death was a side note in the countrywide reports, a short prompt of a disgrace that felt like it pertained to a distinct 100 years, and he was interred in a blank grave in Montana, far from the corridors of might, and the lenses he had once wooed with such fervor. His Wikipedia page stayed a savage, firm digest of a profession defined by its crash, a lasting cyberlog of the male who picked the French laundry over the necessities of the ignored, showing the golden youth had eventually located his calm not in the worship of the mobs or the majesty of the Oval Office, but in the frigid, truthful hush of the hills, finally realizing that the sole thing that endures is the veracity,